May it please the court, my name is Angelina Hensley, and along with my co-counsel, Henry Nguyen. We represent the petitioner in today's case of Students for Fair Admission v. University of North Carolina. I will be answering the following question presented. Is race-conscious affirmative action consistent with the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution? I will be addressing the following 2 points in arguing that race-conscious affirmative action is not consistent with the 14th Amendment in the United States Constitution. 1. Racial situations are, in this day of age, addressed and publicly spoken on. So having a system that was meant to spread awareness of equalness between races during a time period where minorities were seen as less than is no longer needed. Since our generation has made many changes where now racism is widely looked down upon and spoken on and faced head on. And 2. Affirmative action does not follow the principles of a meritocracy, which causes social tensions to arise between races. It causes simply more harm than good. Moving on to my first point. Affirmative action, the current policy, was presented in the early 1960s United States to combat racial prejudice during the hiring process of an individual, and later on expanded to address gender discrimination. The reason affirmative action was presented to the United States is due to racial discrimination that was still occurring even after every man and woman who was considered a minority was free, and were expected to be treated the same no matter what race they were. For example, if a person who applied to a college or job around this time had a different skin tone than the preferred tone of the employer, they would be heavily discriminated against simply for this fact, thus causing them to be denied immediately. Affirmative action was created to combat unequalness and unaddressed racism so that no individuals would be denied because of skin tone. It was a system created during a time when racism was simply just socially accepted without any regard of if true or not. But racism, compared to this day of age, is extremely looked down upon and heavily criticized in today's media, and not just thrown away to the side as it once was. Numerous movements and petitions have arisen in our generation voicing their concerns and many instances of their experience with racism at work or simply for a living, now making the topic knowledgeable and now known and causing these individuals who are racist to now face mass repercussions of their actions and words against minorities. The Black Lives Matter movement is an example of this. This movement originated after the death of Trayvon Martin and continued to grow with the death of Michael Brown, both young black men whom both were shot while unarmed by an officer of the law. But this movement became a national and well-known hashtag after the death of George Floyd, a black man living in Minneapolis after having a brutal death in police custody. Black activists used George Floyd's death as a symbol of the intolerance and injustice that they experienced simply for being their race. During this movement, 15 million to 26 million people in the U.S. participated in George Floyd protest, arguing that Black Lives Matter and expressing their anger against the racist assumptions and actions that officers and individuals in power have made simply on an individual's race. This movement has been one of the largest racial justice protests in the United States since the Civil Rights Movement, and went far beyond that, inspiring a global reckoning with racism across the nation's border. In this generation, minorities are no longer a silent group. They have voices, and this movement proves that. Affirmative action is no longer needed because we as a generation speak on racism. We have evolved as a whole since then. Onto my final point. A meritocracy is a government or the holding of power by people selected on the basis of their ability. That being said, it's the exact opposite of affirmative action, which affirmative action strives to be. Affirmative action portrays a system where all bases are about equality, but in reality, it harms it because not everyone is given an equal chance with this system implemented. University of California v. Bake is a prime example of how the system does not establish fair chances for all. Bake was a white man who applied to medical school at the University California at Davis test-wise and results-wise, his scoring was acceptable and rather admirable. He was an above average admittee applying, yet was simply denied because of a race quota the school had to fulfill. Bake sued the university, arguing that him being denied on such reasonings was unconstitutional and a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The court held that these entrance standards disregarded the Equal Protection Clause and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The court corresponded the analysis of the two, finding that a violation of the Equal Protection Clause is prejudice, which the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits. In this case, the court applied rigorous scrutiny, reasoning that the Equal Protection Clause mandates that a government has a persuasive claim with this scarcely tailored means to blatantly establish that actions on race alone, as was the case here. When making this system of affirmative action, the main purpose was to ensure equality for minorities alongside individuals who are white, or of any other race under affirmative action. But this so-called equality only goes so far. Affirmative action tries to create a system out of meritocracy principles, but goes against the definition of a meritocracy. Why try to achieve a system of equality, promising every individual a fair chance of success and admission, when clearly the way you try to fix this simply does not fit those principles? This system simply just causes more discourse between races and individuals and does not cause any good to occur in this day of age. I will now pass it on to my co-counsel.
May it please the court. My name is Nguyen, along with my co-counsel, Angelina Hensley. We represent petitioner in today's case of the Student for Fair Admission versus the University of North Carolina. I will be addressing 2 points. First, the affirmative action supports an unfair system where certain minority groups are favored. Second, affirmative action have not achieved its true purpose. Moving to my first point. The Constitution quotes, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privilege or immunities of the citizen of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person life, liberty, property without the due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction to the equal protection of the law. Every person who is U.S. citizen deserves to be treated fairly under the Constitution of 14th Amendment. There shall be no privileges that create unfairness for all citizens. The University of Texas was among the many university and bonus race admission policies. In 2003, the university already had in place an admission policy designed to raise the number of underrepresented minority attending its flagship campus in Austin by admitting the top 10% of the graduate of each Texas high school without regard to the SAT score. Soon after the decision, however, the university announced that it was still dissatisfied with the university student body. 21% of the body was composed of underrepresented minority, which include about 17% of Hispanic and 4.5% of African American. And that the school would be implementary preference to boost that diversity. Under the new policy, the proportion of the student body composed of Hispanic and African American rose to 25%. Many universities have raised the bar for minority students too high, which result in unfairness in academic admission. Standard that whites and Asians must meet in order to gain admission, they were, however, above the necessary for African American and Hispanic students. This have warranted unequalness and opportunities for other students. Colleges have been too reliant and priority raised for admission. This led to a violation of the Civil Rights Act and the purpose of the 14th Amendment. Moving on to my second point. Affirmative action laws are policies that instituted by the government to help level the playing field for those historically disadvantaged due to factors such as race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. These laws typically pertain to equal opportunities in employment, education, and business. But as time goes by, people have started questioning the effectiveness of the affirmative action. Minority students lack of interest in academic careers often want a sample of the mismatch in academics. But the strongest evidence comes from the field of science and engineering. Contrary to what many might expect, college-bound African American and Hispanic students are just interested as white students in among majoring in science and engineering. Indeed, empirical studies show that they tend to be a little bit more so, but these are the difficult measures that many students abandon. Significantly, African and Hispanic students jumped ship at a much higher rate than whites, almost double the rate. It is not surprising that students with lower entering academic credentials give up on their ambition to get the degrees in science and engineering more than students with higher academic credentials. The affirmative action have hurt students more than it helped them. One consequence of widespread race preferential policy is that minority students tend to enroll in colleges and universities where their entering academic credential put them in the bottom of the class, which forced them to drop out eventually. Affirmative action also induced low grades as a serious problem, as demonstrated by the research over the course of last decade. For example, in one study of top law school, more than 50% of African American law students who have been admitted by the pursuant to affirmative action policy were in the bottom 10% of the class, and the dropout rate among them was twice as much as their white peers, 19.3% versus 8.2%. As University of San Diego law professor and U.S. Civil Rights Commission Gail Heriot details in a special report for the Heritage Foundation. There's a similar dropout rate among students admitted to the affirmative action policy and white students admitted as legacy with entering credentials that match those students admitted because of race preferences. The affirmative action in many studies have shown that it's an unequal academic across different minority groups. The affirmative action have not just created unfair competition between all races, but did as a barrier for minorities to achieve their own academic success. If there's no further question, we pray the court to overrule the lower court and rule in favor of the petitioner.
I will now be asking questions. Does the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment prohibit race-conscious affirmative action?
The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment does prohibit race-conscious affirmative action. Affirmative action preaches for equality, yet follows principles of reverse racism and discrimination between unfavored races. Therefore, it causes it to be prohibited under the 14th Amendment.
How does legislation enacted by Congress in the 1860s and the 1870s affect your answer to question number 1?
The Act of 1866 prohibited discrimination and was thus deemed constitutional by the committee of the framers the act was brought upon. This act represents the exact opposite of what affirmative action tries to achieve and portray itself as. Because they are polar opposites, the Act of 1866 was constitutional while affirmative action simply could not be. The Act of 1875 further proves that affirmative action is unconstitutional because this act was just a follow-up for the Act of 1866 and made sure that everyone was guaranteed freedoms.
Let's assume that the framers of the 14th Amendment concluded that race-conscious legislation was constitutional in the 1860s and the 1870s. Would that argument still work more than 150 years later in a very different society?
No, because everything would change under a 150-year period. Around 1860s and 1870s, which was during the Civil War time. Before the Civil War, the vast majority of the black population, including nearly 100% of the blacks living in the South, did not enroll or prohibited from enrolling in college. Nowadays, all races should be seen as equal. Therefore, if the race-conscious legislation passed in 1860s and 1870s, it would be irrelevant today.
Let's assume that the framers of the 14th Amendment thought that people of African descent deserve certain race-conscious privileges due to the unique context of slavery. Would the framers have argued that members of other races, such as Hispanics, Asians, and Native Americans, would receive similar privileges?
The framers of the 14th Amendment's opinions on affirmative action would be other races should also deserve the privilege since they face discrimination and a numerous challenge while living in America during this time.
What would the framers of the 14th Amendment have thought about affirmative action policies that benefit people on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity?
The framers of the 14th Amendment's thoughts on whether affirmative action would impact people based on their sexual orientation or gender identity would most likely not have been one of their worries. Affirmative action mainly revolves around the race of an individual. Also, individuals back then that identified alongside the LGBT community were heavily discriminated against and still are.
Does Brown versus Board of Education prohibit race-conscious affirmative action? In your answer, please address Bakke and Grutter.
Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, does not prohibit race-conscious affirmative action. U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public school violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Since the racial segregation had been since that violated the 14th Amendment.
In 2003, Grutter observed that 25 years after this case, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interest approved today. Will there ever be a point in time which racial preferences are no longer needed? If not, should the court allow racial preferences to go on forever?
Yes, Your Honor. Judging an individual based on their racial preferences should not be used regarding college admission. In Bark v. versus the University of California, they were using race as a factor in college admission. And if they did not fit the specific race, they need to fill the quotas. The individual immediately didn't qualify. Affirmative favors certain race than others, which is exactly administration did in the past that affirmative action wanted so bad and to get rid of. I believe that because of our generation and how unspoken it is, we will someday reach a point where racism will no longer be simply tolerated. And instead to face, an individual who spews racist comment will not face repercussion.
Should Grutter versus Bollinger be overruled, please address the Supreme Court's recent decision of stereodesis in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization.
Yes, Your Honor. The Supreme Court should overrule Grutter versus Bollinger, because many data have proven that the affirmative action have not achieved the desired result and even hurt the student.
If the court declines to overrule Grutter, can the plaintiffs prevail?
Plaintiff can still prevail. There are many court cases have been dismissed or been ruled by the feminist action side. Some of them are Martin versus Wilkes and Fisher versus University of Texas. As long as the citizen seeing that affirmative action is no longer relevant and promoted inequality, the plaintiff will still prevail.
If the court overrules Greta, will the military have difficulty recruiting a diverse armed service?
No, the military will not have the difficulty time recruiting a diverse armed service. In a statement released by the DoD, Department of Defense, in February 2022, quote, some 41% of military identify as a member of the minority group, and that number will grow larger. Garrison said, the military must be able to attract and retain for the services to retain competitive edges, he says. Nowadays, few Americans between ages of 18 to 24 qualify for military services or even. So, the military have to find out ways of getting a broader talent pool and broader interest group in order to bring those highly qualified, talented individuals in. This has shown that military are in need of military men. Therefore, if the applicant qualify, they should have gone at the job. Serving in the military is not just a job, it's a commitment to defend our country.